Picture Venice in the Renaissance, glittering canals, masked balls, and whispered sins behind locked doors. But beneath the beauty, there was a trade few dared to mention: the hidden world of male prostitution. Young men, some barely grown, were sold to nobles, foreign merchants, and even priests. Brothels disguised as bathhouses lined the back canals, while the city that preached morality quietly profited from desire. Court records and secret letters reveal a system built on power, poverty, and survival, where pleasure was currency and silence was protection. Was it freedom, corruption, or something darker? A business the city could never afford to expose. Comment the time you're watching this morning, midnight, or somewhere in between. And if you want history told as it really was, raw, human, and unfiltered, hit subscribe. No pressure, but the next story goes even deeper into the shadows of the past. Venice is beautiful, but like most beautiful things, she's also a little bit of a liar. From the bridges down to the black water, the city shines like a dream. But take one wrong turn, and the smell of salt and rot reminds you this place floats on secrets. You walk through narrow alleys lit by weak lanterns, hear laughter bouncing off the walls, and realize something strange. Everyone here seems to be pretending to be someone else. That's kind of Venice's whole thing. A mask, a smile, and a story that's never quite true. In the Renaissance, it wasn't just about art and trade. It was about performance. You didn't just survive, you played a role. And behind that role, under all that silk and candlelight, a darker business thrived, the kind no one put in writing. Sure, everyone knew about courtesans, the glamorous women who entertained nobles and poets. They were practically celebrities. But hidden behind all that perfume and gossip was another market, one that dealt in young men. It was quiet, dangerous, and for many the only way to eat. Imagine a city where beauty could pay your rent, but honesty could get you killed. The Senate taxed brothels, the church preached purity, and yet half the priests and merchants were sneaking into back rooms on the same nights. Hypocrisy wasn't a crime here, it was a lifestyle. You might walk by the Doge's palace and think this was a city of saints and scholars. But come midnight, the same men who passed moral laws were hiring gondoliers to ferry them to private company. Venice looked like a marble jewel by day and turned into a carnival of whispers by night. And speaking of carnivals, everyone wore masks, not just for the festival season, but sometimes just to be free. Behind those masks, rules vanished. A nobleman could meet a fisherman. A priest could laugh like a sinner. For a few hours, nobody knew who was who. Maybe that's why the mask became Venice's most honest symbol. It let people lie without feeling guilty. Picture it: a narrow room by the canal, lit by 2 candles. Outside, the sound of oars. Inside, a merchant and a boy, no older than 16, talking softly, pretending they're invisible. The city outside still hums with music, bells, and the faint smell of wine. Nobody writes about moments like these, but they happened more often than you'd think. You might ask, didn't the authorities crack down on this? Oh, they tried on paper. The Council of 10 Venice's secretive rulers loved to keep tabs on immoral behavior. But here's the thing. Half the people writing those laws were doing the same thing behind closed doors. So instead of justice, what they really traded in was silence. Secrets were worth more than gold. There's something about that double life that feels oddly modern, right? Cities today still do the same thing. Polish their image for tourists while hiding the parts they don't want you to see. Venice just did it better, with better lighting and nicer clothes. And through it all, the city stayed quiet. Nobody talked about the boys who disappeared from apprenticeships or the servants who started showing up at noble feasts in new jewelry. Everyone saw, but no one saw. That's the kind of magic Venice practiced, not turning water into wine, but turning shame into silence. Standing on the edge of the Grand Canal, you can still feel it. The water glows faintly in the lamplight, and for a second you swear the city's watching you back. She's been keeping secrets for centuries, and tonight she's about to tell you one of them. You wake up to the sound of church bells and boatmen shouting, but Venice doesn't really have mornings. It just drifts from one kind of dream to another. The sun hits the domes, the air smells faintly of wine and seaweed, and from behind shuttered windows you hear music. Lute's laughter, maybe a sigh or two, that isn't exactly prayerful. Step into one of those palazzi, and you'll find something strange. The rooms are lined with tapestries, the tables heavy with glass and fruit. And yet the most expensive thing in the room isn't the art, it's the people. These were not the wild brothels of the poor. These were salons of taste where noblemen bought company like others bought paintings. The hosts, young men dressed in fine linen trained to sing poor wine, quote poetry, and flatter egos. You might think of them as servants, but that's not quite right. They were entertainment luxury and sometimes comfort. Some were apprentices, fallen on hard times. Others were sold into service by families too poor to feed them. A few, just a few, saw it as an opportunity. In a world where a shoemaker's son would never be invited to a duke's dinner, charm could open doors that birth never could. Take the story of Pietro Aretino. For instance, the man was Venice's sharpest tongue and dirtiest pen. He mocked popes, flattered kings, and made a living from scandal. He also kept a circle of beautiful young men who served as his assistants. No one questioned what kind of assistance they provided. In Venice, clever men learned early that what you said with a wink didn't need to be said out loud. Inside these salons, it wasn't just desire being traded, it was influence. A flattering word in the right ear could mean a commission, a loan, even a political favor. Some boys became confidants to men who ruled the Republic. Others just became another story whispered over breakfast. You might ask yourself, were they prisoners or performers? The truth is, they were both. They learned to read moods like maps, when to smile, when to vanish, when to look like they weren't listening, while remembering every word. One wrong move could mean exile or worse. Venice wasn't kind to scandal, but it thrived on pretending it didn't exist. Still, there was glamour in it. Imagine walking through candlelit halls being dressed in silk. You didn't pay for hearing people call you bello, as if beauty alone were a currency. And in Venice, it was. For some of these men, a night's charm could buy them a week's food or a lifetime of regret. Here's the irony: the same city that painted Madonnas on every wall also painted boys as angels, their faces modeled after real ones who worked these salons. Art immortalized what society refused to name. You can still see them, those soft, knowing faces, in Titian's and Veronese's paintings. They look divine, but their eyes tell another story. By now, you've probably noticed the pattern Venice never really condemns. She just looks away. She knew this trait existed, just as she knew the smell of the canal at low tide. It wasn't pretty, but it was part of her. If you were one of these young men, survival meant being useful. Not just beautiful useful. Maybe you could play an instrument, recite Petrarch, or mix wine with just the right joke. The ones who learned quickly might end up under the protection of a noble house. The ones who didn't well. The canals have no shortage of ghosts. There's something deeply human about all this, isn't there? The hunger for attention, the trade of affection for survival. It's not just a Venetian story. It's what people still do. Only now, it happens online instead of in candlelight. The setting changes, the bargains don't. Outside, the bells ring again. A gondola glides past its oars, slicing the silver water. Somewhere in that same city, another boy puts on a smile that isn't quite his own, adjusts his collar, and prepares to play the role Venice demands of him tonight. Venice likes to pretend that everyone has a choice, but if you follow the smell of bread through the poorer quarters, the cramped islands behind San Polo, or the outer edges of Cannaregio, you'll find boys who never got to choose much of anything. The sound here is different. No lutes or laughter, just hammers, waves, and the scraping of boats against wood. Most of the people you pass are apprentices, tailors, glassblowers, shipbuilders. Their hands are raw from work, their clothes faded from the salt air. Some of these boys were orphans. Some were sent here by families who hoped the city might turn them into something useful. What the city really turned them into depended on luck and the kindness of their masters, if such a thing existed. You see, apprenticeship in Renaissance Venice wasn't just about learning a trade. It was a contract of power. The master provided food, shelter, and instruction, and in return, the boy owed loyalty, labor, and silence. If you were talented, maybe you became a craftsman someday. If you were beautiful, sometimes your work never left the bedroom. There's a story half whispered in old records about a glassmaker's apprentice from Murano. He was barely 15. His master found better use for him than blowing glass, and when the scandal reached the guild, they quietly reassigned the boy to another master on another island. The punishment wasn't for the abuse, but for getting caught. That's how Venice handled things it didn't want to see. You might think, why didn't someone help them? But this was a city where reputation meant everything. A boy who accused a nobleman or master could be punished for false testimony. And who would believe a penniless apprentice against a man of rank? Even if the council listened, they'd say he tempted him. That phrase, tentazione, shows up again and again in old court documents. Somehow, the powerless always did the tempting. Some found other paths. The smarter ones realized there was more freedom in selling pleasure directly than pretending it wasn't happening. At least on their own, they could negotiate. It sounds strange, but in a way, prostitution was sometimes the only form of control they had left. They weren't property anymore. They were professionals. Street-smart, quick-talking, and painfully aware of how fragile their power was. Picture them at night, leaning against the bridge railings or waiting near the steps of San Cassiano, the lamplight catching the edges of their faces. They weren't allowed to speak to noble women, but they knew exactly what kind of glance could make a man stop mid-stride. It was performance the same kind that powered the city's theaters. Only here, the applause came in coin. Some boys vanished into this world, completely forgotten, even by the parishes that recorded their births. Others climbed higher than anyone expected. There's a record of one young servant who became the assistant of a wealthy merchant, then his secretary, and eventually inherited his patron's home. Officially, it was for faithful service. Unofficially, everyone knew what that meant. Venice, as usual, didn't care so long as the taxes were paid and the streets stayed quiet. The Senate passed laws to ban sodomy every few decades, mostly for show. Enforcement was selective. The rich could pay fines or arrange confession. The poor ended up whipped or exiled. Justice in Venice wore a blindfold, not because it was fair, but because it preferred not to look. If you've ever worked a job where your boss took all the credit and none of the blame, you already understand the Venice system. Replace paperwork with prayer, and it's not so different. The power flowed one way. And if you broke the rules, you didn't just lose your job, you could lose your life. Now imagine being 17 broke and half-starved standing under a balcony while the city glitters above you. Somewhere inside, laughter spills from a window. You can smell roasted fish, hear the sound of a harpsichord, and you wonder if I looked different, if I spoke softer, would they let me in? For many, that thought alone was the start of a trade they'd never escape. That's how Venice worked. It didn't need to force you. It just made survival look like seduction. Here's a thought that'll make you pause in Venice. Even confession could be dangerous. You kneel in the dim light of a chapel, whispering sins through the wooden screen. And on the other side, the man who listens might be part of the very world you're confessing. Hook enough good. Because this is where faith and hypocrisy dance their closest waltz. The church was everywhere in Renaissance Venice. Bells ruled the day. Priests blessed marriages, heard secrets, and buried the dead. But for all its sermons on purity, the clergy was knee-deep in the same underworld it condemned. That's not gossip, it's in the records. The Holy Office in Venice investigated dozens of clerical indiscretions, most involving boys who worked in sacristies or served Mass. The irony. Many of those same priests sat on moral tribunals afterward. You can almost picture it, a young altar boy promised education and protection suddenly living in the priest's home. He wears fine robes, eats better than his family ever did, and slowly realizes he's traded hunger for silence. There's no courtroom for that kind of injustice. Just fear-whispered prayers and the sound of a door closing at night. Still, Venice wasn't a city of villains. It was a city of justifications. The church called these sins of weakness, and confession became a revolving door. Sin, repent, repeat. The balance sheet always came out even. Some confessors even advised temporary abstinence rather than true change. One chronicler dryly noted Venetian priests preach virtue while buying the time of its victims. It's easy to laugh at the hypocrisy now, but in Venice, religion and reputation were inseparable. People needed to be seen as godly, even if no one truly believed the act. Imagine a modern influencer posting motivational quotes between luxury ads. It's that same brand of holiness for hire. What made it worse was how money sanctified everything. A fine paid to the church could cleanse almost any stain. Brothels that catered to nobles were tolerated zones. Poorer offenders, meanwhile, got correction through pilgrimage, which is a poetic way of saying exile. You walk barefoot across Italy until you disappear. The church could forgive, but only if you could afford forgiveness. And yet, faith still wrapped the city. People believed in miracles, relics, and saints. Even the boys caught in this shadow world sometimes prayed that confession might erase what survival forced them to do. One record tells of a young man named Giovanni, barely 18, arrested for unnatural acts. In prison, he begged to confess before his execution. The priest who heard him, the same one who had paid for his company a month earlier. Venice has never been short on dark poetry. The clergy's involvement created a strange equilibrium. No one could accuse too loudly without risking mutual exposure, so the silence held. It was a web of guilt, where everyone was caught and no one could afford to tug too hard. That's how an empire of sin survives through shared shame. And through it all, the city carried on. Mass at sunrise, markets at noon. Masked parties by night. The same people who clutched rosaries during confession were renting rooms near Rialto before the ink on their prayers dried. It wasn't that they didn't fear God, they just assumed he understood business. Think about that. In Venice, faith wasn't about truth. It was about balance. You sinned. A little, donated. A little, prayed a little, and hoped the scales stayed even. It's a system humans never really outgrew, just updated. Now instead of indulgences, we call it damage control. You step out of that church. Now, the marble cold beneath your shoes, the canal glittering just beyond the door. A gondolier hums softly. Somewhere, a priest locks his study. Venice exhales as if nothing ever happened. But you know better. Behind that pious calm, another mask just slipped into place. You'd think a city run by laws, councils, and oaths would have some control over all this chaos. But Venice wasn't just governed by politicians. It was run by spies. The famous Council of Ten was the Republic's invisible hand, and it knew everything, or at least pretended to. Picture 10 men in crimson robes sitting beneath a lion carved from marble. Their job: protect the state, their method secrets. They kept the city in line through a mix of fear, rumor, and very creative paperwork. The council didn't only chase traitors or smugglers, it also watched what people did behind closed doors, especially if those people were powerful. You might ask, why would a government care who was sneaking around at night? The answer's simple: blackmail is cheaper than war. If a nobleman had a scandal buried under his silk sheets, the council could use it to make him obedient. One note, one witness, one quiet threat, and suddenly taxes got paid on time, loyalties stayed firm, and no one mentioned the word rebellion. The archives of Venice are full of reports that sound like spy thrillers written by candlelight. Anonymous letters poured into drop boxes carved like lion mouths any citizen could inform on another. Some letters accused rivals of heresy, others of unnatural acts. The latter were gold for the Council of Ten. They didn't just record them, they stored them like insurance policies. Imagine you're a merchant with ships in Alexandria and debts in Padua. One night, a young man visits your house. A week later, a small, folded note arrives at your door, sealed with the council's crest. It doesn't accuse, it simply says, "We trust your loyalty remains with the Republic." You pay your taxes a little faster that month. Venice's obsession with secrecy made it both strong and rotten at the same time. It's what kept the Republic stable for centuries. Everyone feared exposure more than punishment. Even the rumor of a scandal could sink a family faster than plague. No trial needed. A whisper was enough. And here's the strange twist. The same men enforcing morality were often clients of the same forbidden trade. So they wrote the laws, then broke them, then used those same laws to destroy others. It's like watching someone set a trap just to prove they can avoid it. If you've ever worked in an office where the boss scolds people for gossiping, right after gossiping, you already get the Council of Ten's energy. They called it governance. You'd probably call it manipulation with extra paperwork. There's one case that historians still debate. A nobleman accused of maintaining a house of male indulgence near Rialto. The council investigated, of course, but the report ends abruptly. Why? Because one of the council members was on the guest list. The case was quietly destroyed. The message was clear. Sin was tolerable as long as it was useful. In a way, Venice turned secrecy into currency. The brothels paid taxes, the nobles paid hush money, and everyone pretended not to notice the gold flowing into the state treasury. Even the city's festivals, those glowing nights of masks and music, were political tools. The more people indulged, the less they rebelled. Distraction kept peace better than soldiers. Sometimes, walking through those silent stone corridors, you could almost feel the paranoia. The council's spies didn't wear uniforms. They could be anyone, a servant, a gondolier, a neighbor. Even your confessor might work both sides. People learned to speak in code, to smile carefully, to never trust the walls. Venice was the original surveillance state, just with more lace and better wine. So, the next time you see one of those dreamy paintings of gondolas gliding under the moon, remember somewhere behind that beauty, someone was watching and taking notes. The city stayed quiet, not because it was peaceful, but because everyone knew the cost of being overheard. The water laps softly against the steps as you walk away from the council chambers. The night feels still, but that's just another illusion. In Venice, silence was never peace. It was the sound of fear, learning to hold its breath. Night in Venice isn't dark. It glows. Lanterns swing above the canals. The air hums with laughter, and the city feels like it's wearing its own mask. The wealthy throw masquerades that last until dawn, where no one knows anyone's name. And that's exactly the point. You put on silk, a powdered wig, a simple black mask, and for a few hours, you're free. Free from your title, your poverty, your past. That's the strange beauty of the Venetian mask. It wasn't just for carnival. It was a kind of passport. Behind it, the rules stopped mattering. Nobles mingled with fishermen. Widows flirted with merchants. And somewhere in the mix, a duke's son found himself dancing with a dock worker. The mask made everyone equal, or at least let everyone pretend they were. And that's where stories began. You can almost see it, a marble hall, filled with music, velvet drapes trembling with movement perfume, and sweat mixing in the air. The guests wear smiles sharper than their jewels. One mask, simple and plain, hides a boy from the poorer quarter. Another gilded and feathered hides the face of someone whose family name could buy half the lagoon. They meet in the middle of the dance floor. No one knows, no one cares. There's something tragic and romantic about it. For one night, they can be whoever they want. They can laugh, touch hands, whisper like equals. But when dawn comes and the masks come off, one goes home to silk sheets, the other to an empty pocket. Venice doesn't believe in happy endings, just good stories. Of course, not every encounter was so innocent. Many of these masked balls doubled as recruiting grounds for those seeking company. Behind the music deals were made with a nod or a glance. A nobleman could arrange a private meeting through a servant, and by morning, the arrangement was done. Venice didn't need brothels for its elite. It had masquerades. One chronicler wrote that the mask freed desire from shame, and he wasn't wrong. In a world obsessed with appearances, anonymity was the only luxury that truly mattered. Under the mask, you could confess without speaking love, without consequence, and sin without leaving fingerprints. But masks cut both ways. They protected, yes, but they also deceived. There are stories of young men lured into promises that turned cruel once the masks came off. A noble's favor could vanish overnight, and a boy who thought he'd found escape could instead find himself exiled or accused. That's the price of pretending too well in a city built on pretense. Still, Venice adored its illusions. The same faces that whispered beneath the masks by night would pass each other in daylight with polite nods as if they'd never met. Maybe that's why no city in Europe painted the human face better than Venice. Its artists understood masks because everyone wore one. Even today, when tourists buy cheap masks at Rialto, they're echoing that same old desire to hide and be seen at the same time. To live without consequence, even for a moment. The Venetians just did it better with candlelight and music instead of selfies and filters. You might wonder how nobody lost their minds in this web of secrets. The truth is, they probably did. But Venice was addicted to pretending everything was fine. It's like when you walk into a fancy restaurant and everyone's smiling even though the kitchen's on fire, you play along because that's what elegance demands. So when you see two masks leaning close in a shadowed corner, whispering behind their fans, remember, this was the real Venice. Not the marble, not the paintings, not the power. The city lived in these borrowed moments where truth hid behind laughter and love, dressed itself in disguise. The music fades now. A few masks are tossed into the canal, floating like ghosts. The sun is about to rise, and with it, the city will pretend again. But for a few hours in the dark, Venice forgot her rules and remembered her hunger. It begins quietly. A cough in a gondola. A body carried through the streets at dawn. Within weeks, the bells ring so often the sound becomes part of the air. Venice, so proud, so glittering, starts to smell of death. The plague has returned, Hook enough good, because this part of the story shows you how a city built on pleasure reacts when the music stops. By the mid-1500s, Venice had seen plague before. It always came the same way on ships with trade goods with people. The same boats that brought spices from the east brought sickness too. And as always, it found the weakest first, the poor, the workers, the ones who didn't have enough silver to flee to their country villas. At first, the trade in flesh slowed. Who would risk a stranger's touch when death could be hiding under the skin? But hunger doesn't wait for miracles. The same boys who once sold smiles in candlelight now offered company in exchange for bread or safety or just someone to talk to. The mask, once a symbol of freedom, became a shield from breath and fear. It's strange how survival rewrites morality. Suddenly, the city that once whispered about sin began to whisper about contagion, prostitutes. Male and female were blamed for spreading the hand of God, but they were also needed. Loneliness, it turns out, doesn't quarantine well. When the streets emptied, deals still happened behind closed shutters, quieter, riskier, desperate. There's one record from the plague year of 1576. A magistrate fined a man for unlawful companionship while the city was under lockdown. The man paid his fine, walked home, and died 2 days later. Venice kept the money. That's bureaucracy for you, efficient even in catastrophe. You walk through the ghost city in your mind canals, silent shop doors nailed shut, gondolas tied and rotting. The laughter that once filled the nights is gone. Even the bells toll mechanically, as if the city's too tired to mourn. And yet, in the shadows, some business continues. Because when survival becomes the only law, everything else, faith, dignity, fear, turns negotiable. Here's the twisted part. As people died, wealth changed hands fast. Some of those who survived the plague years rose higher than they ever could in peace. A few young men, kept by wealthy patrons, suddenly found themselves inheriting houses, coins, even servants. Death had rearranged Venice's social ladder. One historian put it bluntly: the plague punished sin, but rewarded the survivors. And after the wave passed, Venice did what Venice always did. She cleaned her face and pretended nothing had happened. The churches held Thanksgiving processions, the brothels reopened, and the water festivals returned. The city built a church, the Redentor, as a monument of gratitude to God for sparing them. Pilgrims prayed inside. Deals resumed outside. But the plague left a mark that never washed away. People had learned that pleasure could be safer than faith, and that bodies could disappear faster than names. Fear made the trade crueler. Older men demanded younger boys. Fresh meant clean. Some customers even asked to see proof of health before paying. It's almost modern, isn't it? A primitive version of medical screening, except the stakes were life and death. There's something eerie about how fast Venice bounced back. Other cities mourned. Venice dressed up again. The same canals that had carried corpses now carried gondolas full of music. And if you listened closely, beneath the songs, you could still hear the echo of that cough, the reminder that beauty here was always one breath away from decay. You can't help but think maybe that's why Venetians lived so intensely. They saw how fragile everything was. Every laugh, every mask, every promise, it could vanish tomorrow. And so they kept dancing, buying, lying, loving all under the same shadow. As the city recovered, the trade didn't just return, it adapted. The plague had thinned the population, but demand never disappeared. In fact, scarcity made beauty more valuable. The business of pleasure became colder, more calculated. For those who lived through it, the line between survival and sin was gone for good. You leave that memory behind now, stepping into the humid dawn. The city glitters again, but you know better. The water beneath the gondolas carries everything: gold dust, ashes, and ghosts, especially the ghosts. Venice never really buries her ghosts. She just paints over them. Walk into any art gallery today, the Gallery dell'Accademia, say, and look closely at the faces staring down from the walls. Cherubs, saints' young attendants, holding lyres or wreaths. The guides will tell you they're symbols of virtue, but you've read enough of Venice by now to suspect otherwise. Artists here didn't just paint the divine, they painted desire. Soft curls, half smiles, eyes that seem to follow you a little too knowingly. Some of those angels were modeled on real boys from the salons and streets, the same ones who entertained the city's elite. Painters like Titian and Veronese were masters at hiding suggestion inside sanctity. You think you're looking at Saint Sebastian. You're really looking at someone's favorite companion, immortalized under a new name. One Venetian diarist once got to me, it's called art, the Republic's cleanest sin. That's the secret. The same men who confess their urges on Sunday would hire painters on Monday to eternalize those urges in oil. In the right light, it became culture instead of scandal. Hypocrisy once again dressed itself beautifully. You can almost picture the studio, the smell of pigment and linseed oil, the scratch of brushes, the young sitter told to hold still while the artist murmurs about light and symmetry. Maybe he's flattered, maybe he's cold, maybe he's just wondering if this portrait will hang in a palace he'll never be allowed to enter again. The patron, of course, stands nearby, pretending to discuss technique while enjoying the view. It's not just art, it's ownership. To have your muse painted was proof of status, of taste, of power. The face might go on a saint's body, but everyone in Venice knew whose beauty it was. Sometimes the code was almost comical. A boy painted as an angel of music might hold an instrument his patron owned, a tilt of the head, a particular color of sleeve, tiny hints left for those in the know. It's like the Renaissance version of a private social media post, public, but understood by only a few. And this wasn't limited to painters. Poets wrote verses about friendship, sculptors carved divine youth, and composers dedicated sonatas to beloved pupils. It was all the same language of disguise. The church couldn't ban beauty itself, so it learned to tolerate it as long as it wore a halo. There's a funny sort of logic to it. When society tells you your desires are shameful, you either bury them or turn them into art. Venice, being Venice, chose art. Every portrait became a confession wrapped in gold leaf. Every statue, a prayer whispered through marble. If you've ever watched a movie that romanticizes something ugly, crime, heartbreak, addiction, you've seen this trick in action. Venice just did it 4 centuries earlier. The same city that punished flesh learned to worship it on canvas. The difference between sin and beauty here was simply lighting. And what about the artists themselves? Some were participants, others voyeurs, all of them complicit. They painted what their patrons wanted, but they also painted what the city allowed. That's the quiet brilliance of Venice. It censored nothing directly. It just made sure you knew what couldn't be spoken. You wander through a gallery now centuries later, and the silence feels heavy. Those painted eyes still follow you. Amused, a little sad, as if they know their story isn't really finished. They survived longer than their masters, longer than their judges. Time has turned scandal into heritage. It's strange, isn't it? What once cost someone their reputation is now printed on postcards. The same faces once whispered about in alleyways now hang in museums with polite captions like "Study of a Youth." Nobody blushes anymore. We've forgotten the lives behind the brush strokes. You pause in front of one of those paintings, Saint Sebastian, again tied to a column arrows grazing his skin, his expression too serene to be holy. Somewhere, you think the artist's real muse is smiling, because Venice always found a way to make sin look sacred. And 500 years later, she's still doing it. If Venice had a stage for punishment, it was the Piazza San Marco, the same square where nobles paraded in gold and diplomats were received, also hosted public shame. The city, for all her masks and indulgence, loved the theater of morality. And when she decided to make an example of someone, it was always a performance. Crowds gathered like they would for a festival. Vendors sold, wine bells rang, and the accused were marched out under the bright sun. Some were thieves, others heretics. But sometimes the crowd came for something more scandalous. Trials for unnatural acts. That polite phrase covered everything the city didn't want to admit it tolerated. Imagine it. Young men, stripped of their fine clothes, heads shaved, their names shouted by an official who likely had his own secrets. The same neighbors who once paid for their smiles now threw insults to prove their own innocence. Venice didn't just punish people. She made the punishment entertaining. But here's the real cruelty: justice wasn't equal. If you were poor, your sentence came fast and public. If you were rich, it came with negotiation. Nobles accused of the same sins usually faced a fine or temporary exile. The city understood that scandal was expensive, and it couldn't afford too much of it, so the law bent, like wet wood, always snapping toward the powerless. Records from the Council of Ten mention rehabilitation by labor, which sounds like charity, until you realize it meant being chained to oars in the Republic's galleys. Imagine rowing through the Adriatic sun for years, pulling the Empire's ships, while Venice pretended you didn't exist. It was punishment, disguised as patriotism. And yet not all judgments ended in chains. Some were theatrical boys, paraded through the streets, with placards reading "Sinner," their faces smeared with ash. Others were confined to convents to repent. The city loved symbols of repentance, almost as much as sin itself. It was all part of maintaining the illusion that morality had teeth. There's one grim story from 1518, a barber's apprentice caught in a nobleman's home, both arrested. The boy was whipped and exiled. The nobleman fined and freed. Later that same year, the nobleman was seen at carnival mask on Laughter Loud, as if the whole thing had never happened. Venice had no shortage of lessons about how much truth money could erase. But sometimes the city went too far. In moments of moral panic, the punishments became medieval theater. There were drownings, hangings, even rumors of secret executions carried out at dawn, bodies quietly dropped into the lagoon. The water, as always, swallowed everything. Still the crowds came. They wanted the comfort of believing order existed, that the city's sins could be burned away by public disgrace. It's a bit like when people on social media tear someone apart for doing the very thing everyone else does, punishment as performance, not principle. Human nature hasn't now changed much since Venice's golden days. We've just swapped piazzas for comment sections. The irony is, these spectacles rarely stopped anything. Within days of a public execution, the same secret trades resumed in the same dark rooms. Venice understood this better than anyone. If you can't kill desire, you might as well choreograph it. So, the Republic punished the poor, pardoned the powerful, and called it justice. Walking across that square, now centuries later, you wouldn't know it ever happened. Tourists feed pigeons, orchestras play the air smells of espresso instead of fear. But the stones remember. They always do. If you listen closely, the echoes are still there, footsteps of the condemned, laughter of the crowd, and the quiet whisper of a city pretending it wasn't watching itself. Venice built her greatness on contradiction art, beside cruelty worship, beside vice beauty, beside suffering. That's what made her powerful, and what makes her unforgettable. Every mask, every law, every sermon was part of the same play. And when the curtains closed, the city kept the applause for herself. At dawn, Venice looks holy again. The canals turn silver. The bells sound softer, and for a moment, it's easy to believe the city was innocent all along. But the still water has a memory. It keeps every secret that ever sank beneath it. You stand on the edge of the lagoon, watching the mist drift like slow smoke. Gondolas slide by their oars, dipping in and out of silence. Somewhere far off, a church bell tolls, and the sound feels older than the stones themselves. This is Venice. After the show, no music, no laughter, just the echo of everything it tried to hide. The truth is, the beauty that draws the world here was paid for by people history never named. The painters got credit. The patrons got glory. But the ones who fed the city's hunger, the apprentices, the servants, the street boys, were washed away by the tide of time. Venice buried them, not with dirt, but with silence. You can almost see them if you look long enough. Faces flickering in the reflection of a lantern. Voices slipping through the fog. They built the intimacy the city sold to the world. They were its heartbeat, invisible but constant. And when they disappeared, Venice didn't mourn. She just put on another mask. That's what makes this place so haunting. The same hands that poured wine for nobles also carved the wood for the gondolas. The same mouths that whispered verses in salons once begged for bread. Venice blurred those lines until nobody could tell where sin ended and survival began. Every empire learns to hide its cruelty behind art. The Romans had their marble. The French had their gardens. Venice had her reflections. She turned tragedy into beauty so perfectly that even now you can walk her streets and not realize what you're standing on. Look at the basilica, gold mosaics glimmering under the morning light. They say each piece of glass there represents a prayer, but maybe some of those fragments came from lives the city never prayed for. Maybe that's why the light feels both sacred and sad. You lean over the railing, staring at the green water. It looks calm, but it's never still. Beneath that surface lies the weight of centuries, coins, bones, and promises. Venice was always a city that traded in all three, and yet for all her hypocrisy, she remains beautiful. Maybe that's her greatest trick. She teaches you that beauty and corruption can live side by side like twin reflections in the same canal. You can hate what she did and still fall in love with her. Maybe that's why people keep coming back. Maybe that's why the ghosts never leave. So as the sun rises and the city wakes, you take one last breath of the salt air. The bells ring again, not for morning this time, but for another day. Venice smiles faintly, as if daring you to forget. But you won't, because once you've seen her truth, the water never looks the same again. Venice taught you that beauty often hides its bargains. Behind the music, the masks, and the art was a trade no one dared name, a world where survival wore perfume and silence bought safety. Yet the story doesn't end here. Across Renaissance Europe, another hidden empire was rising, the forbidden glittering lives of the courtesans. The belles of Venice are already arguing again. You stand there, halfway across a bridge, and the sound rolls over the water, like gossip, loud, proud, and impossible to ignore. The air smells like sea salt, mixed with candle wax, and someone's expensive perfume drifting out of a window. Welcome to the Renaissance, where everything shines on the surface and rots beautifully underneath. And here's the hook in this city of saints and sinners. The women with the most power weren't queens or wives. They were courtesans. Venice in the 1500s was like a glittering stage that never closed. Everyone performed. The merchants showed off silk from the east, the nobles flexed with marble palaces, and the church pretended not to notice any of it. But beneath that polished mask, another world pulsed, one ruled by charm, beauty, and dangerous intelligence. The courtesans lived there, walking that thin line between luxury and scandal like they were born on it. You wander through the narrow streets, and the sound of laughter bounces off the walls. Somewhere behind a curtain, a man is whispering poetry to a woman who knows exactly how much every syllable is worth. Courtesans weren't simple companions. They were conversational athletes trained in art, music, philosophy, and survival. Imagine a Renaissance influencer, except her feed was candlelit salons and her captions came in verse. Take Veronica Franco, born in Venice, clever, bold, and far too smart for the century she lived in. She wasn't just beautiful. She could out-argue scholars and outright half the poets in town. When men insulted her for being a courtesan, she didn't hide, she published poetry. One of her lines still hits hard. When we too are armed and trained, we can convince men that we have hands, feet, and a heart like yours. Tell me that doesn't sound like a mic drop from 1570. Venice, for all its piety, was built on contradictions. The same priests who condemned vanity sat for portraits covered in gold. The same city that banned public indecency had an official registry of honest courtesans, basically a government list of women too classy to arrest. Sounds almost modern, right? Like filling out paperwork to declare your charm a taxable profession. You keep walking and notice the quiet deals that make this city breathe. Every silk dress, every polished gem, every candlelit dinner hides a negotiation. A courtesan might earn more in one evening than most men in a year, but every coin came with strings attached. If a patron got jealous or bored, her fortune could disappear overnight. Fame was protection until it wasn't. Even Veronica Franco learned that the hard way when she was accused of witchcraft. Surviving the Inquisition cost her everything except her words. Picture it for a second, midnight in Venice. The water glows with the reflection of lanterns, and the city feels half asleep, half drunk. Somewhere above, a woman leans over a balcony, listening to the soft splash of oars. She isn't waiting for romance. She's waiting for her next move. In a world where women had almost no power, she found a loophole, and she used it. Of course, not every story was gilded. Many courtesans started as poor girls trained to charm men they didn't choose. Some were sold into the trade by families who couldn't afford to eat. Others were tossed aside when their youth faded. Venice loved them while they glittered, then pretended not to know them when the candles went out. For every celebrated Franco, there were dozens of women whose names sank quietly into the lagoon. Still, they left fingerprints everywhere on the arts, on fashion, even on language. They set trends inspired painters like Titian and shaped how the city spoke and dressed. Their faces appear in portraits, labeled Venetian Lady, as if history itself blushed to admit who they really were. Yet you can see it in their eyes, that mix of pride, fear, and mischief that says, I know something you don't. The sun finally crawls up behind the domes, washing the marble in gold. The night's secrets scatter like glitter at the end of a party. Somewhere, a courtesan unpins her hair, wipes off her paint, and starts her day like anyone else, except she knows the whole city still spins around the stories she helped create. You wake with Venice. The bells haven't stopped ringing, but now they sound less like gossip and more like someone clinking coins on a table. The markets are already alive, fishmongers shouting, gondoliers whistling, and somewhere, a girl no one notices yet is learning how to survive in this city of masks. She won't stay invisible for long. Every courtesan starts somewhere, and it's rarely glamorous. Some are daughters of merchants who fell on hard times. Some are servants who caught a nobleman's eye. Others are simply too clever to accept a life of scrubbing floors for a few coins. Imagine being a young woman in a time when your only choices are marriage, the convent, or the streets, and realizing there's a fourth option, becoming a courtesan. It's risky, but it's a way to turn your mind, your manners, and yes, your beauty into a living. The training wasn't official, but it was real. Older courtesans taught the newcomers how to read sing dance and debate. They practiced how to pour wine gracefully, how to flirt without looking desperate, and how to make a man think he's winning an argument even when he's not. That's not charm, it's strategy. Courtesans knew that intelligence was a better investment than youth, because wit doesn't wrinkle. If this sounds a bit like Renaissance finishing school. Well, it kind of was. Venice's high courtesans were expected to be more educated than most noblewomen. They read Petrarch-quoted Virgil and discussed politics between love poems. In a world that told women to be silent, these women turned conversation into currency. You might picture them as painted and perfect, but a real courtesan was more like an actress. She played a part-changed costume depending on her audience and never forgot the line between affection and performance. A patron might fall in love, but she never did. She couldn't afford to. Love in this trade was like drinking seawater. It only made you thirstier. Still, it wasn't all manipulation. Many courtesans built genuine partnerships with their patrons, especially the smart ones who valued conversation as much as pleasure. Some men became their protectors, others their students, a few even their rivals. Letters survive, playful, sharp, full of wordplay that would put modern flirting to shame. You can almost hear the laughter echoing through the candlelight. The Venetian state didn't officially endorse courtesans, but it quietly relied on them. They kept powerful men entertained, reduced the risk of public scandal, and even served as unofficial diplomats when politics required charm instead of armies. A few historians argue that courtesans were Venice's soft power, the polite mask the Republic wore to deal with the rest of Europe. And they weren't confined to Venice. Across Renaissance Europe, from Florence to Paris to Madrid, the same dance played out. Wherever there was wealth, there were courtesans. In Florence, the Medici family's court shimmered with poets and mistresses. In France, the royal mistresses practically ran the palace. Catherine de' Medici herself once used her ladies-in-waiting, nicknamed Flying Squadron, to gather secrets from powerful men. You could say Europe's real politics often unfolded in bedrooms rather than boardrooms. But back to Venice, where it all feels like theater. You picture a young woman stepping out of her tiny room onto a narrow bridge at dawn. She adjusts her silk shawl, checks her reflection in the canal, and whispers a quick prayer not for forgiveness, but for luck. Because luck is everything. One wrong word to the wrong man, and the silk turns to rags. One charming evening with the right patron, and suddenly she's living in a palazzo with servants of her own. It's strange, isn't it? A society that worshipped the Virgin Mary also celebrated women who lived by breaking the very rules she represented. But that was the Renaissance, brilliant, hypocritical, and full of contradictions. The same man who condemned sin at Mass might send a diamond bracelet to his favorite courtesan by sunset. If you're wondering how people justified it, they didn't. They just called it the way of the world. Venice floated on double standards as easily as it floated on water. The rich called it pleasure, the poor called it survival, and the courtesans called it Tuesday. And maybe that's what makes their story fascinating. They weren't just victims of their era, they were players in it. Women who refused to disappear quietly. They found cracks in the wall of patriarchy and slipped through dressed in silk and perfume, smiling like they knew something everyone else didn't. By midday, the streets are bright again, full of merchants shouting and children chasing pigeons. Somewhere above them, a courtesan is practicing a new song, humming to herself as she waits for nightfall, the hour when her real life begins. You follow the sound of laughter into a salon glowing with candlelight. The air smells of orange peel rosewater and expensive secrets. A group of men in lace collars lean too far forward, pretending to care about poetry while watching the woman who's reading it. That woman, a courtesan, isn't just performing. She's surviving one clever sentence at a time. Here's where you really see how they thrived through conversation. The Renaissance adored talking. Ideas were currency, gossip was entertainment, and wit was a kind of weapon. Courtesans didn't just master small talk, they elevated it into an art form. They could shift from debating Plato to teasing a merchant about his terrible Latin without missing a beat. The goal wasn't just to impress, it was to keep control. If a man was laughing, he wasn't thinking about power. You might compare it to hosting a podcast in a time before microphones. Each evening, a courtesan became both interviewer and star guest, keeping the room buzzing. The stakes everything. Say something dull, and you're forgotten. Say something too sharp, and you risk offense. But say it just right, something smart, funny, or a little scandalous, and you're unforgettable. In Venice, salons were their stages. Courtesans entertained noble scholars and travelers who came from as far as England just to brag that they'd been in the same room. Letters from visitors describe these gatherings with awe. She speaks like a goddess. One French ambassador wrote about a famous courtesan named Tullia d'Aragona. Tullia was not only beautiful, she published philosophical dialogues about love and reason. Imagine being a woman in the 1500s and teaching men logic for fun. The power dynamic was odd but real. Men came to show off their intellects and ended up admiring hers. Courtesans understood how to make someone feel brilliant while quietly steering the entire conversation. They'd flatter egos, drop literary references, and never forget who was watching. Behind every smile, a calculation. Behind every compliment, a strategy. And the way they presented themselves was a language of its own. A flick of the fan, a pause before answering, a playful raise of the eyebrow. It's not that different from how influencers use body language today. They crafted images carefully, hairstyles copied from noble women, jewels chosen to shimmer, just enough the voices trained to sound musical, but never shrill. The goal wasn't seduction, it was distinction. To be noticed, remembered, and respected even if society refused to admit it out loud. Sometimes, the courtesan's salon overlapped with the artist's studio. Painters like Titian and Giorgione filled their canvases with women whose faces mirrored real courtesans. Look at those portraits of Venetian ladies reclining in silks, the slightly mischievous eyes, the faint smile that knows too much. Everyone in town recognized them, but no one dared to say their names. The portraits became their armor, freezing their beauty in time while the world pretended they were anonymous. It wasn't all smooth sailing. The same charm that brought power also brought enemies. Some wives whispered accusations, calling them corrupters of morality. Jealous rivals spread rumors. Priests thundered from pulpits about fallen women, knowing half their congregation was sneaking to those same salons. Venice loved scandal almost as much as it loved the sea. And yet courtesans navigated it all with astonishing grace. They understood image management centuries before the word existed. When gossip spread, they countered it not with denial, but with spectacle. One might host a poetry night, donate to a church, or sponsor a painter. Each act saying, I am part of this city's culture, not its shame. If you ever feel like your life is a balancing act, between being yourself and fitting in, imagine what it was like for them. One wrong move and everything collapsed. But they still managed to turn their existence into art. Literally. Some wrote sonnets. Others performed music. They were banned from noble titles. So they built their own kind of fame, the kind that didn't need permission. Outside, the canals are quiet now, reflecting the moon. You can almost hear the faint sound of applause through the shutters, a laugh here, a sigh there. A courtesan finishes her poem, bows lightly, and looks right at you for half a second. Her eyes say, "See, I'm not the joke. I'm the mirror." And for a brief moment, you understand why the most dangerous thing in Renaissance Europe wasn't the plague or the sword. It was a woman who knew exactly what she was worth. They say love can move mountains, but in Renaissance Europe, love moved money. And behind the perfume poetry and candlelight, no one understood that better than the courtesans. To them, affection wasn't a feeling. It was a business model. Every smile, every sigh, every carefully delayed glance had a price tag hidden under the silk. If Venice was a stage love was the script everyone pretended to believe in, courtesans didn't sell love itself. They sold the illusion of it, and they sold it flawlessly. Their clients were not desperate dreamers, but men who controlled armies, banks, and kingdoms. The same men who shaped the Renaissance by day came to these women at night, seeking something their arranged marriages could never give them, to be seen, understood, and occasionally entertained. Picture one of those nights. A marble floor glowing in lamplight. The smell of warm wine and oranges. A man sits beside a courtesan flushed with both pride and uncertainty. She listens to him talk about politics as if it's thrilling gossip, nodding gently, never breaking eye contact. Every pause, every tilt of her head is deliberate. She lets him believe he's fascinating when in truth, she's memorizing his secrets. In Venice, seduction and strategy shared the same perfume. You might want to judge that, but remember, this was one of the few ways a woman could carve out independence in a world designed to silence her. Courtesans learned to turn charm into survival, and survival into art. They weren't scheming villains or tragic victims. They were women, making the best of a world stacked against them. Veronica Franco. Yes, her again knew how to balance it all. She wrote poems to her patrons that read like love letters but stung like satire. She could flirt and philosophize in the same sentence. In one of her sonnets, she warned, "He who does not know love does not know life." Coming from a woman paid to perform, love that line hits differently, doesn't it? Of course, some of her patrons believed their feelings were real. They wrote sonnets back, promised fidelity, swore devotion, and then married someone else. That was the rule of the game. A courtesan's greatest heartbreak wasn't being betrayed, it was being forgotten. The same men who called her a muse might later condemn her as a sinner. Renaissance hypocrisy was an art form all its own. Still, not every story ended in bitterness. Some courtesans found a strange kind of stability through long-term patrons. A few became trusted advisors, mediators, even confidants in political matters. Their rooms often served as neutral ground for secret negotiations. When diplomacy failed, flattery sometimes succeeded. You could say that while men ruled Venice, women like Franco helped keep it from falling apart. Love in this world wasn't soft or romantic. It was tactical. The exchange of gifts, poems, and promises was more like trading stock than sharing hearts. The richer the token, the deeper the illusion. Pearls dress as gold necklaces. They weren't just decoration. They were receipts. Each one said, "I matter. I'm worth the price." Think about it. How different is that from modern relationships built on image? Fancy dinners, text messages crafted like scripts, people posting their perfect love online while living separate lives offline. We may laugh at the Renaissance for its masks, but ours are just digital. The game hasn't changed, only the lighting has. And yet sometimes, just sometimes, real emotions slip through the cracks. A courtesan might fall for a man who treated her kindly, or a patron might see her as more than a performance. Those moments were dangerous, though. Love had no safety net in their world. The moment a courtesan lost control of her own feelings, she risked everything: her livelihood, her freedom, her carefully crafted reputation. So, she learned to love privately, if at all, to smile through jealousy, to keep heartbreak hidden behind powder and pearls. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. Because in Renaissance Venice, love didn't rescue women, it ruined them. When you step back into the cool night air, the canal looks calm, pretending it never saw what just happened behind those shutters. The city itself feels complicit, whispering, "This is how things are." And somewhere inside, a courtesan sits by the dying flame of a candle, staring at her reflection in a silver mirror, and quietly thinks love may not have saved her, but it certainly made her unforgettable. Morning in Venice begins with bells and hypocrisy. You can almost set your clock by it. Priests thunder from pulpits about virtue, while gondoliers go past palazzos where sin is practically paying rent. The church was powerful, yes, but in the Renaissance, it also had a funny habit of condemning what it secretly financed. You'd hear sermons warning that women like courtesans were the city's ruin, tempting men away from their holy duties. But step behind the cathedral walls, and you'd find bishops sending gold-chained silks, and occasionally poetry, to those same women. It's almost poetic how much moral outrage could fit into a man who also enjoyed velvet sheets. The truth is, the church and the courtesans needed each other. The church preached purity. The courtesans proved temptation. It was like a play both sides agreed to perform. Without sin, there was no virtue to sell, and Venice was nothing if not a city of merchants. You pass by the grand facade of San Marco, its mosaics sparkling like confessions turned into jewelry. The people kneeling inside pray with one eye open, glancing at each other, measuring devotion the way others measure dowries. Outside, a group of young men laugh as they slip coins to a masked woman before disappearing down an alley. That's Venice, in one breath, holy water and perfume side by side. Even Veronica Franco couldn't escape the church's double game. After she'd risen to fame publishing her poems and earning the favor of noble patrons, her enemies accused her of witchcraft. They said she bewitched men with her words, as if intelligence were sorcery. The irony, many of her loudest critics were clergymen who had attended her salons. Franco faced the Inquisition in 1580, answering calmly, refusing to bow her head. She was acquitted, but the scandal cost her everything. Her books stopped selling. Her wealthy friends disappeared. That's how quickly the church could turn applause into ashes. You might think this sounds far away from modern life, but power still loves pretending it's pure. The Renaissance was just more honest about its contradictions. One raised a cross. The other wrote checks for indulgence. The church collected money to forgive sins, then built cathedrals with it. Courtesans did the same. In their own way, they traded beauty for survival, and sometimes for brilliance. And don't forget, Venice wasn't unique. Across Europe, faith and hypocrisy danced together like old partners. In Rome, popes kept mistresses openly. In Florence, friars preached against vice while secretly hoarding paintings of half-naked angels. In Spain, moral purity became political theater, and anyone who didn't fit the script got burned, sometimes literally. What's fascinating is how courtesans turned moral judgment into publicity. The more the church scolded them, the more curious people became. A scandal was free advertising. Their name spread faster than sermons ever could. And when preachers declared that such women were beyond salvation, the courtesans simply smiled. They already knew salvation wasn't designed for them anyway. The church did try to fight back with laws, banning certain dresses, limiting public appearances, fining those who dressed above their station. Imagine trying to regulate style in Venice, a city where even the bridges wore marble. Of course it didn't work. Courtesans simply hired tailors to design gowns that looked modest in daylight, but shimmered scandalously under candlelight. If heaven demanded humility, they found a loophole in fashion. And then there was confession. Every Venetian was expected to confess sins regularly. But what do you confess if sin is your career? There's a story, maybe true, maybe gossip, about a courtesan who told her confessor father, "My only sin is honesty." You can almost hear the poor man choking on his Latin. Still, for all their defiance, courtesans knew the church could destroy them with a single rumor. So they played carefully, donated to orphanages, sponsored chapel candles, and let artists paint them as saints when the mood struck. It was an uneasy truce between heaven and habit. Both sides pretending to save the city, both too entangled to let go. As you walk along the quiet canal, you notice a priest blessing a gondola before a wedding, and a courtesan watching from her window above. Two symbols of love separated by a few meters and a lifetime of moral distance. Yet, both part of the same city, one selling forgiveness, the other selling fantasy. Venice, after all, never cared who sinned. It only cared that the story was beautiful. The bells ring again, echoing across the water. Maybe it's another sermon starting, or maybe just the city, reminding you that faith and desire were never enemies here. They were business partners. By now, you've probably realized something. The courtesans didn't just survive the Renaissance, they helped design it. When you look at the art, the fashion, even the poetry of the time, their fingerprints are everywhere. They weren't just background figures in history books. They were trendsetters, tastemakers, and sometimes the secret muses behind masterpieces. Walk through any Venetian gallery, and you'll spot them disguised as goddesses. Painters loved to sneak courtesans into biblical and mythological scenes because it made holiness look human. Take Titian's Venus of Urbino. Her lazy confidence, the way she stares straight at you, instead of looking shy. That wasn't a random model. Most likely, it was a courtesan. Renaissance art adored that blend of beauty danger and intellect that they embodied. You might laugh, but in a way, courtesans were the first influencers. They decided what perfumes were fashionable, which fabrics were irresistible, and what poems everyone should quote. The noblewomen copied their hairstyles, while pretending not to know their names. Tailors and perfumers lived off their reputation. And when poets needed inspiration, who did they call? Not their wives, that's for sure. Every detail mattered. The way they spoke walked, even how they laughed. They cultivated mystery the way merchants cultivated spices, carefully, profitably, and always in demand. Some historians believe that courtesans introduced lighter cosmetics made with crushed pearls and rose water instead of heavy white lead, the Renaissance version of a beauty innovation. Others say they popularized subtle perfumes imported from the East, creating a market that still exists today. But their influence went beyond vanity. Courtesans pushed for women's education by proving that intelligence could be alluring, not dangerous. In Venice, the line between scholar and seductress blurred every time a courtesan quoted Ovid to a senator. You could say they hacked the system. If men wouldn't let women into universities, fine, they'd turn their salons into classrooms instead. Tullia d'Aragona did exactly that in Florence. She hosted discussions on philosophy, published a dialogue on love that mixed Plato with sass, and argued that desire could be both rational and virtuous. Imagine saying that out loud in a century when most women couldn't sign their own names. The church may have frowned, but the poets applauded. And then there was the art of portraiture, the Instagram of its day. A courtesan's portrait wasn't just vanity, it was branding. She'd commission painters to capture her at her best, wearing certain jewels, holding a book, or an instrument to suggest refinement. Each detail told a story. The pearl symbolized purity. The dog at her feet meant loyalty. The open window suggested freedom. These portraits circulated among the elite like social media posts, advertising without words. One of the most striking portraits from the era shows a woman with auburn hair, calm eyes, and a faint, knowing smile. No name, just La Bella. Everyone assumed she was a noblewoman, but art historians later found clues that she was, in fact, a celebrated courtesan of her time. The irony. She achieved the one thing noblewomen never could: immortality. Even the language of romance owes them something. Courtesans perfected the art of letter writing, part love, part negotiation. Their letters were witty, dramatic, and dangerously honest. Some of those letters still survive, tucked away in archives like whispers frozen in time. They show women who weren't just surviving under male power, but outsmarting it one paragraph at a time. And for every grand achievement, there was quiet irony. Courtesans shaped the very culture that condemned them. They were painted as saints and sinners, praised for their beauty, punished for their boldness. Venice liked to pretend it ran on law and order, but truthfully, it ran on silk secrets and charm, and courtesans held all three. Try to imagine the power in that. To know that a gesture, a dress, or a line of poetry could ripple through an entire city. To realize that you, a woman the law barely recognized, could decide what beauty meant for everyone else. They didn't sit on thrones, but they ruled through influence, and influence then, as now, lasts longer than crowns. Outside, the fog rolls in again, softening the city's edges until everything looks painted. Somewhere in that blur, a painter dips his brush, a perfumer mixes another vial of rose oil, and a young courtesan hums to herself while practicing a lute song. She doesn't know it yet, but her reflection will end up in someone's artwork, her voice in someone's poem, her style in someone's story. History will remember her face even if it forgets her name. You'd think the courtesan's biggest problem was men, but no, it was women. Not all women, of course, but specifically the ones with titles, husbands, and reputations to protect. The noble wives. And here's the twist. While courtesans danced through ballrooms, wrapped in silk and confidence, those wives watched from behind lace curtains, seething quietly into their embroidery hoops. Imagine being a noble woman in Renaissance Venice. You're married by arrangement, expected to produce heirs, and barely allowed to leave the house without permission. Then right across the canal, there's a woman with freedom. She reads, sings, and entertains the same men who tell you to be silent. You can see why jealousy wasn't just personal. It was political. Courtesans were everything respectable. Wives couldn't be witty, independent, admired. They got the jewelry, the poetry, the attention. The wives got sermons about modesty. That imbalance created a silent war played out through gossip, snide remarks, and sometimes, well, actual sabotage. There are letters where noble women complained about courtesans corrupting morals and bringing shame upon the city. But often, those same ladies secretly imitated their rivals' hairstyles or perfume choices. Hypocrisy, once again, was the Renaissance's favorite fashion accessory. The Venetian Senate even passed laws trying to separate decent women from courtesans by dress color, jewelry type, even how low a neckline could go. It was like medieval social media moderation. That outfit has been flagged for inappropriate luxury. Courtesans, of course, found loopholes. They layered sheer veils over daring gowns, wore subtler jewels, and turned modesty itself into temptation. Nothing infuriated respectable wives more than realizing that restraint could be seductive too. But jealousy wasn't the only weapon. Blackmail slithered through the corridors of power like smoke. Nobles' wives hired spies, maids, stable boys, servants to gather dirt on their husbands' favorite courtesans. A single rumor well placed could end a career. And when courtesans became too visible, two influential enemies whispered accusations, witchcraft, heresy, treason. You didn't need proof in those days, just a crowd and a priest with free time. The Council of 10 Venice's shadowy network of spies often kept tabs on high-class courtesans, not because they cared about morality, but because these women knew everything. Who was sleeping with whom? Which merchant was secretly bankrupt? Which ambassador was leaking state secrets after one too many glasses of Chianti? Courtesans could make or break reputations, and that made them dangerous. There's a story, half rumor, half record, about a courtesan named Julia, who received a letter sealed with the crest of a powerful noblewoman. Inside was a note that said only, "Stay away, or God will strike you down." Julia reportedly laughed, pinned the letter to her dressing table, and wore a cross the next night just to make a point. God didn't strike her, but the noblewoman's husband certainly did visit again. Still, the tension between wives and courtesans wasn't always pure hatred. Some noblewomen quietly admired them, even envied them. After all, courtesans could speak freely, entertain guests, and discuss politics privileges most wives didn't have. A few even hired courtesans as tutors in conversation and etiquette. Imagine learning charm from the woman your husband once flirted with. Venice truly had a sense of humor. Sometimes that rivalry turned into strange alliances. When plague or war hit the city, women across all ranks worked together to fund hospitals and charities. Courtesans donated money anonymously, often more generously than nobles. But their names never appeared on plaques or memorials. Respectable society liked their money, not their memory. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the gossip floating through those narrow streets, the hiss of envy disguised as prayer. Courtesans became scapegoats for everything: failed marriages, political scandals, bad weather, probably even spoiled wine. Yet the men kept visiting, the artists kept painting, and the wives kept pretending not to notice. It's funny, isn't it? How the most moral societies always seem to have someone to blame for their temptations. Courtesans didn't create desire, they just learned to survive inside it. And in a world where silence was safety, they refused to be quiet. That alone made them unforgettable, and to some, unforgivable. The night creeps in again. You hear distant laughter, soft music, the clinking of glasses. Somewhere, courtesan leans over her balcony, watching a noble couple walk below her, smile a mix of pity and amusement. She knows the wife hates her, and the husband fears her. But in the game of appearances, she's the only one who's free. Morning light hits the lagoon like broken glass. Venice wakes slowly, but not everyone rises to the sound of church bells and market shouts. Somewhere in a faded room that once smelled of jasmine and candle wax, a courtesan stirs. Her sheets are plain now, her mirror cracked. The letters she once received, perfumed, sealed with gold, have stopped coming. Fame, it turns out, has the lifespan of a rose. The city that once adored her doesn't look up anymore. A few years ago, gondoliers whispered her name with awe. Poets wrote verses. About her lips, painters begged to capture her eyes. Now, when she passes through the market, people lower their voices. The younger girls, still shining in silk, glance at her and see their future if luck runs dry. For the courtesans who aged out of favor, the fall was steep. Beauty was their ticket in. Time was the doorman showing them out. Some tried to transition into teaching young women the arts of refinement. Others married minor merchants or faded into convents, their jewels traded for anonymity. Venice didn't imprison its former courtesans, it simply erased them. Veronica Franco knew that feeling too. After her trial, her fortune vanished. She spent her final years trying to care for her children, renting out rooms in her home, still writing, still proud, but forgotten by the same city that once celebrated her. When she died at 45, she left behind more brilliance than gold. History eventually remembered her poems, but in her own time, silence was her reward. You might think, how could Venice be so cruel to its own icons? But the city never promised love, only applause. And applause, as any performer knows, stops the second you leave the stage. Courtesans lived in a world that worshipped youth and punished survival. The older they grew, the more invisible they became. It's a story that feels uncomfortably familiar, isn't it? Even now, fame burns fast and forgets faster. Some women tried to reinvent themselves through religion. A few entered convents not out of devotion, but necessity, hoping to find peace in routine. Others found work as companions or matchmakers, still using the only skills the world allowed them. And some simply disappeared into the quiet edges of the lagoon, living out their days in small apartments, smelling of damp wood and memories. Yet even in decline, there was a strange dignity. Former courtesans were known to dress simply, but elegantly, walking through piazzas with a grace that no poverty could erase. They carried the echo of their former selves, like ghosts, women who had once moved senators, now bargaining for bread. But you can't strip someone of presence once she's learned to own a room. There's an account from a French traveler who described meeting an elderly Venetian lady who spoke fluent Latin and recited poetry while selling herbs in the market. He didn't realize until later that she had once been one of Venice's most celebrated courtesans. Her beauty, he wrote, was gone, but her words could still stop a heart. Maybe that was the truest kind of immortality. The Republic, meanwhile, kept turning. New faces replaced the old. New scandals replaced last year's sermons. The courtesans' portraits stayed on walls, their poems on dusty shelves, but their names faded from conversation. It was safer for the city that way to enjoy their legacy without acknowledging it. Venice had always been good at separating beauty from guilt. You step onto a bridge at sunset and glance at the water below. It's easy to imagine the reflection of all those forgotten women still drifting somewhere under the surface, smiles trapped in the ripple of light, laughter echoing through the stones. They may not have statues or tombs, but they left something stronger than marble memory. Because the truth is, the courtesans were never just ornaments in history. They were part of the engine that powered the Renaissance, the unseen muses behind art, literature, and diplomacy. The tragedy is that the same brilliance that made them indispensable also made them disposable. A gondolier calls out to no one in particular. As he rows past, his voice tired but tender. The city looks the same, but everything has shifted. The palaces that once hosted their laughter now stand quiet. Yet somehow, you get the feeling that if you listened closely enough, you might still hear a faint echo of music from centuries ago, a soft reminder that glamour fades, but presence lingers. And that's the cruel poetry of it all. Venice gave them wings, then clipped them the moment they tried to fly too far. But history, patient, as the tide has a way of bringing lost things back to shore. You can feel it in the air, the shift from whispered scandal to open punishment. Venice has grown tired of pretending its double standards make sense. The courtesans who once ruled conversation now face judges instead of poets, and gossip turns into evidence overnight. You walk past the Doge's palace, and the air itself feels nervous, thick with the sound of paper being stamped and names being erased. The city has always loved control, and morality made the perfect excuse. Laws appeared like spiderwebs, fine enough to catch the weak, too fragile to trap the powerful. Courtesans were fined for indecent dress, for corrupting youth, for living in sin. The men involved, their names rarely even appeared on the records. Justice Renaissance style had a very selective memory. One famous case tells of a courtesan named Elena, who was accused of hosting immoral gatherings. The accusation came from the wife of one of her patrons. Shocking, right? When the trial began, half the court was pretending they didn't know her, and the other half was pretending they hadn't visited her house. Elena stood there, alone, draped in a plain gown that used to be silk. She said one line that made it into the archives. "If I am guilty, so are you. Only difference is, I was honest about it." The court fined her anyway, but that sentence still hangs in the air like the city's best comeback. You follow the canals, and you can almost hear that defiance echo. The courtesans may have lost their wealth, but not their voices. When power turned against them, they found quieter ways to fight back, through letters, through satire, through rumor. A whispered insult in the right ear could cost a senator his seat. After all, no one knows a man's secrets better than the woman he tried to impress. But not every battle was clever or glamorous. Some courtesans ended up in debtors' prisons, accused of deceit or theft simply for trying to survive. The Republic was merciless toward women without protectors. In Florence and Rome, the Inquisition watched closely. In Venice, the Council of Ten did. Spies reported on suspicious women who read too much, laughed too freely, or spoke to foreigners. The Renaissance loved beauty, but it feared freedom. Still, the courtesans adapted because what else could they do? A few disguised themselves as widows and continued working in secret. Others reinvented themselves as artists, models, musicians, or private tutors. Some even used the courts to their advantage, suing former patrons for unpaid debts. There are dusty records of legal petitions where women demanded justice in elegant handwriting, arguing their case better than any lawyer could. You can almost hear the exasperation of the clerks, forced to admit grudgingly that they had a point. And not every story ended in ruin. A handful managed to outsmart the system entirely. They invested early, bought houses under false names, or made strategic marriages once they'd saved enough. Those rare few died comfortable, their secrets buried with them. It's tempting to call them lucky, but luck in Renaissance Venice was just another word for skill disguised as chance. Meanwhile, the city's obsession with morality grew louder. Brothels were raided, regulations tightened, and priests doubled down on their warnings. But Venice couldn't fully rid itself of what it secretly loved. Courtesans, even as they disappeared from sight, still haunted its culture. Artists painted anonymous beauties that everyone recognized. Poets kept writing sonnets about forbidden affection. And travelers kept coming drawn to the city's reputation for elegance and danger. A reputation those women had built. The hypocrisy reached absurd levels. Officials who condemned courtesans publicly were caught sneaking into their houses privately. The church held purity processions that passed right by salons glowing with laughter. Venice had mastered the art of pretending innocence while selling temptation by the canal. And maybe that's why the courtesans endured so long, not in flesh, but in memory. Because deep down, the city needed them to be its shadow. You pause by the Bridge of Sighs, the name suddenly too fitting. Prisoners once crossed it on their way to judgment, catching a last glimpse of the sunlight before vanishing inside. Maybe some of those women crossed this bridge too, the sound of water below mixing with their heels on the stone. The city that once celebrated their brilliance ended up silencing them under the same marble arches that had echoed their laughter. Yet Venice could never quite wash them away. Their stories survived in paintings, their wit in letters, their defiance in the footnotes of history. Even the courts, in all their sternness, left behind records that preserved their words forever. And centuries later, you're still hearing them. Maybe that's what victory looks like. Not glory, not gold, but the quiet endurance of being remembered when everyone expected you to disappear. The Republic may have written laws to erase them, but history kept receipts. As night spreads over the canals, the air hums with the same contradiction that defined them all: guilt and glamour, punishment and survival. The bells toll again, softer this time, as if the city itself feels a bit ashamed. The city sleeps now. The canals shimmer under moonlight, and for a moment, Venice looks like it never sinned at all. But if you stand still and listen long enough, the silence isn't empty. It's layered. Beneath the hum of water and the sigh of wind, through shutters, you can almost hear them. The laughter, the footsteps, the whispers of the women who once ruled this place from behind closed doors. Centuries later, their ghosts haven't left. They linger in museums and paintings, hiding in plain sight behind saintly titles. Look at Titian's Flora. In Florence, the soft curls, the faint smile that doesn't apologize for existing. Or Palma Vecchio's beautiful Venetian woman, once labeled simply anonymous. But art historians now whisper another truth. Those weren't just faces. Those were courtesans painted not as sinners, but as symbols of a city that couldn't decide whether to worship or condemn them. You walk through the Gallery dell'Accademia, passing portraits where eyes follow you through the centuries. They seem to ask, "Do you finally see us?" For years, historians tried to rename them, to turn them into mythwives or muses. But the truth has a way of resurfacing, just like the sea beneath Venice's stones. Those anonymous women shaped art culture and conversation, and the city's heartbeat still sounds suspiciously like theirs. Their lives were forbidden, yes, but also extraordinary. They bent the rules without breaking them, turned conversation into currency, and played power like a harp. They taught Europe that elegance could be as influential as politics, and that intelligence could be seductive long before anyone dared to admit it. The Renaissance wasn't just built by kings and painters. It was built by women who never got the credit line. Every cobblestone here carries a memory. A courtesan brushing her hair by the window, watching dawn gild the domes, clutching a letter that smells faintly of rose water and regret. A jealous wife whispering a prayer that sounds a lot like envy. A gondolier humming a tune he doesn't realize was written by a woman he could never afford to meet. History doesn't vanish, it just changes outfits. It's strange, isn't it? How the very qualities that damn these women, beauty, wit, confidence, are the same ones we now celebrate. Today, we call it charisma, influence, independence. Back then, they called it sin. But between the lines of old court records and faded poems, you can see the truth. These women weren't moral failures. They were pioneers forced to operate in disguise. Venice has learned to make peace with its contradictions. The same churches that once banned them now hang their portraits. The same streets that judged them now sell postcards of their faces. The city, just like its canals, reflects everything at once: the holiness, the hedonism, the heartbreak. If you ever visit, stand on the Ponte dell'Accademia at sunset. Watch how the light touches the rooftops, soft and gold like forgiveness. Somewhere out there beneath the shimmer, their world still breathes. The rooms where they laughed are now hotels. Their mirrors are antiques. Their names are footnotes, but they're still here. And maybe that's their greatest victory. They weren't erased after all. They were absorbed into the city itself, stitched into its art, its fashion, its vocabulary. Every mask at carnival, every painted flirtation in a fresco carries a bit of their spirit. They turned a city of trade into a theater of desire. And even now, Venice can't stop performing. You take one last look at the water. It glows silver, calm, and deep, as if keeping all their secrets safe. The courtesans of Renaissance Europe lived forbidden lives, but their stories refuse to stay buried. They remind you that power doesn't always wear a crown, that rebellion can sound like laughter, and that the world remembers anyone bold enough to be unforgettable. So the next time you pass a painting of a mysterious woman with half a smile, don't rush by. Stop. Look closer. Because history may have called her nameless, but Venice, even in its silence, still whispers her name. And now, as the waters of Venice grow, still let your mind drift with them. The courtesans have finished their dance, once dazzling, now quiet, yet their laughter still ripples through time. They were women who lived between shadow and candlelight, shaping beauty from survival art from pain. The city that once judged them now glows softly in their memory. So close your eyes. Hear the faint echo of their voices on the canals, whispering that nothing beautiful is ever truly lost. Rest easy tonight, traveler. History is asleep beside you, still shimmering beneath the moon.